A watch, frozen forever at midnight, but its silence hid a story louder than words. When Daniel found his grandfather's old watch, he thought it was just another relic gathering dust in the attic. But then he noticed the hands locked at 12:00. Midnight. It hadn't ticked for decades. Why did it stop at that exact moment? What happened on the night when time itself seemed to shatter? And why did his grandfather keep it, but never speak of it? Welcome to The Last Stand, where we tell the stories of forgotten courage, quiet sacrifice, and the legacies that refuse to fade. Tonight, we follow a grandson's search to uncover why a soldier's watch stopped at midnight, and how that moment of silence carried a lifetime of memory. Because sometimes a watch doesn't just measure time, it remembers the price of it. The old farmhouse on the edge of town had stood in silence for years. After Henry Miller passed away, no one really set foot in the attic. Dust gathered on the rafters, boxes stacked one over another, carrying memories that no one dared to disturb. People always said, Henry never spoke about the past. His things are just as quiet as he was. But during his college break, his grandson Daniel let curiosity get the better of him. He remembered the few moments he had with his grandfather, the long silences at the dinner table, the distant look in his eyes. Daniel was convinced there was more to Henry's story than he ever let on. One afternoon, while sifting through the boxes, he uncovered old jackets, yellowed letters, rusted buttons, and then a small box tucked beneath a pile of coats. The lid creaked as he opened it. Inside lay a heavy wristwatch, its leather strap worn, its glass scratched from decades of wear. The second hand was still, the face locked forever at 12:00, midnight. Daniel held the watch in his palm. Its weight felt different, heavier than metal should be. On the back, faintly scratched letters revealed themselves. HM 1944, his grandfather's initials. This watch had gone to war. Daniel tried winding it, twisting the crown gently, but the gears didn't move. The mechanism was dead. Yet there was something almost intentional about its silence, as if the watch had chosen to stop, preserving a single instant for eternity. He thought about all the times his grandfather avoided telling war stories. The man had medals, sure, but they sat hidden in drawers never displayed. And now this watch, a relic that refused to tick. Daniel whispered to himself, why midnight? Why then? That night, he placed the watch on his nightstand. He remembered one thing his grandfather had once muttered when Daniel was a boy, barely old enough to understand. This watch reminds me of the night I owed my life, and the men I still owe. At the time, it hadn't made sense. But now, with the hands frozen at midnight, Daniel felt a chill. The next day, he went to the local library, combing through military records. It didn't take long before he found the name Henry Miller, enlisted, 82nd Airborne Division. Records showed he had fought in Normandy, and then a line in the archives caught his breath. July 1, 1944, during a midnight assault, one of the few survivors, Sergeant Henry Miller. Daniel's heart raced. The watch hadn't just stopped at any random moment. It had stopped at the very hour of that battle. When Daniel returned home, he picked up the watch again. Its cracked glass reflected his own face back at him, almost like it was asking him to keep going. It was no longer just a broken watch. It was a gateway. Midnight wasn't only a time on the dial, it was a scar carved into his grandfather's memory. And Daniel knew then, if he didn't uncover the full story, his grandfather's silence would remain unanswered forever. He clenched the watch in his hand and whispered, Grandpa, whatever happened that night, I'll find out. This watch will show me. The hands remained still, frozen at midnight. But for Daniel, they had just started moving. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the watch wasn't just a family keepsake, it was a witness, a frozen marker of a night that had defined his grandfather's life. If he wanted answers, he needed to follow its trail into history. Back at the small-town library, Daniel spent hours hunched over old microfilm reels. Dusty military logs flickered across the screen. The year 1944 kept drawing his attention like a beacon. There it was again, July 1, 1944, heavy enemy assault at midnight. Casualties high, survivors few. Among them, Sergeant Henry Miller. Daniel leaned closer. His chest tightened. The watch wasn't a coincidence. Midnight was the exact hour the battle had erupted. But records on paper weren't enough. Daniel wanted voices, memories. So he tracked down the local Veterans Hall, a modest building with flags hanging outside. Inside, a few elderly men sat around a table, their stories flowing slowly like the coffee in their mugs. "Henry Miller?" one of them asked when Daniel mentioned the name. The man tapped his cane and nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember. Quiet fellow. Carried a lot of weight on his shoulders. But brave, braver than most." Daniel's eyes lit up. "Do you know what happened that night?" The old man's gaze drifted away, as if peering back through decades of smoke and fire. "It was chaos. Midnight. We were surrounded. Gunfire lit the sky. Men were panicking. But Henry ran straight into it. Pulled wounded men out, one after another. That watch you're holding? I saw it shatter when shrapnel hit his arm. But he didn't stop moving. He never stopped until the last man he could reach was safe." Daniel swallowed hard. "So that's why he kept it all these years." The veteran's voice grew softer. "That watch was his reminder, not of victory, but of who he lost. Some of us came home, others didn't. Henry carried them in silence." Walking back home, Daniel felt the weight of the story settling in. For years he had wondered why his grandfather never spoke about the war, why he stayed so quiet at family gatherings. Now it made sense. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was remembrance. That watch didn't need to tick to tell time. It was already keeping count of a single moment when Henry Miller's world had been torn apart and remade. That night, Daniel placed the watch beside his bed again. Sleep came uneasily. He dreamed of flares exploding in the night sky, of men shouting in panic, of his grandfather young, strong, determined, hauling others through the smoke. And every time the image sharpened, he saw the watch on Henry's wrist, its face cracking, its hands stalling at midnight. Daniel woke with a start, his heart pounding. He stared at the silent watch and whispered, "Grandpa, your war isn't gone. It's still here." The next day, Daniel visited his grandmother at the nursing home. Her eyes, weary with years, softened when she saw the watch dangling from his hand. "So you found it," she murmured. "Why did he keep it, Grandma?" Daniel asked quietly. She sighed, her voice trembling. "Because that night, time stopped for him. He used to tell me, 'I can't fix it. If I do, I'd be pretending that night never happened, and I won't dishonor the men we lost.' That's why, Daniel. That's why he never wounded again." Daniel felt tears sting his eyes. He carried it all alone. She nodded. "Yes, but maybe now you can carry it too in a different way, by telling the story he never could." Back at the library, Daniel dug deeper. Another report surfaced. Sergeant Miller reported that during the midnight assault, his watch was damaged beyond repair. He chose to keep it as a personal reminder of the battle. Daniel stared at the line. It wasn't just a watch. It was his grandfather's way of anchoring himself to memory, even when words failed him. The silence was no longer confusing. It was a vow. The summer of 1944 hung heavy over France. Weeks had passed since D-Day, but the war was far from over. The 82nd Airborne Division was deep in contested territory, moving cautiously through narrow valleys and dark woods. It was the night of July, honest. Midnight was approaching. Sergeant Henry Miller marched with his squad, the silence so sharp it made every snapped twig sound like thunder. The first sign was static, the sudden death of the radio signal. Then the night tore open. Gunfire cracked through the dark. Flares arched into the sky, turning night into a blinding flash of white. Machine guns rattled. Shouts erupted. The Germans had set an ambush. Henry's men dove for cover, confusion threatening to break the line. Henry glanced down at his wristwatch. The hands hit 12:00, midnight, and then the world exploded around him. Instead of retreating, Henry surged forward. "This way," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Bullets tore past him, but he dragged two men out from the mud, pushing them toward cover. A shell burst close by. Shrapnel flew. A jagged piece smashed into his wristwatch, cracking the glass, jamming the gears. The watch froze at midnight. But Henry didn't. He kept moving, dragging a wounded comrade by the collar, hauling another across his shoulders. The weight was crushing, but he refused to stop. By the end of the night, Henry had saved 4 men. But 2 were gone, their lifeless forms left behind in the smoke. He collapsed beside the survivors, chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the broken watch. The hands would never move again. Midnight was eternal. For Henry, the stopped watch wasn't just broken metal. It was the exact moment his life split in two, the men who lived because of him and the men he couldn't bring back. In the days that followed, his commander recommended him for a medal. But Henry refused to celebrate. He never told the full story. He never wanted parades or praise. Instead, he strapped the broken watch back onto his wrist. To him, it was enough. A reminder. A vow. Whenever he looked at it, he thought, "This isn't about me. It's about them. Midnight is when they stayed, and when I kept walking." Through the years, Henry never repaired the watch. He carried it home, wore it in silence, then finally tucked it away. The world saw an old man, quiet and reserved, but in his heart, time had never left that battlefield. And when Daniel discovered it decades later, he wasn't just holding a relic. He was holding the night his grandfather had both saved lives and lost something of himself. Daniel now understood. The watch was not just an heirloom. It was a gravestone in metal and glass, a frozen testimony of sacrifice. But the full weight of its meaning only became clear when he began to share the story. Daniel visited the small-town museum, watch in hand. The curator listened in awe as Daniel explained how the hands had stopped at midnight during a desperate battle in 1944. "This isn't just a broken watch," the curator said. "It's a witness. People need to see this." News spread quickly. Soon, neighbors gathered to hear Daniel's account. Children stared at the watch, their young faces reflecting wonder. Older residents bowed their heads, remembering their own fathers and brothers lost to war. One woman whispered, "My father fought that same night. He came home, but he never spoke either. Maybe his silence was the same as Henry's." A week later, a modest ceremony was held in the town square. Daniel stepped to the podium, the watch heavy in his palm. "This watch," he said, his voice steady, "stopped at midnight, but it did not stop in silence. It stopped in the middle of courage. My grandfather, Henry Miller, saved lives that night. And though he carried the weight of those he could not save, this watch carried his story." The crowd was hushed, some wiping away tears. "This watch will never tick again," Daniel continued. "But every time we see it, we will hear his silence, and silence can sometimes be the loudest cry of all." The town voted to place the watch in the museum. It was set in a glass case, alongside a simple plaque. "Sergeant Henry Miller's watch stopped at midnight, July 1, 1944, a silent witness to sacrifice." When children toured the museum, the guide always paused by the display. "This watch doesn't tell time," she explained. "It tells a story, one of courage, loss, and memory." After the ceremony, Daniel lingered by the case. He whispered softly, "Grandpa, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. We'll carry it with you." For the first time, he felt the weight lift. His grandfather's silence had ended. Not by words, but by remembrance. This wasn't just the story of a stopped watch. It was the story of a soldier who carried a frozen midnight for the rest of his life, and a grandson who chose to give that silence a voice. We all have stopped watches in our lives. Moments left unspoken, memories left hidden, burdens never shared. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to open the box to remember what others tried to forget. Because some watches never tick again. But they remind us that heroism often lives in silence.